Добрый вечер, товарищи. Сегодня в Риге офицеры ФСБ поймали американских агентов в ходе спецоперации по подавлению влияния страны в государствах-членах Европейского Союза. Среди захваченных были 2 дипломата посольства страны в Риге и американский актер и ведущий Михаил Кули. Американское консульство в Санкт-Петербурге ведет переговоры об освобождении 2 дипломатов. Великий президент Владимир Путин попросил аудиенции у енота-шпиона.
Командир, I know you're not Amerikanski spy. I just like video program on pecking wood and football men. If you can help me with one task, you will be released. No question asked.
Okay. What do you mean by task, anyway?
Can you read me this book? I am too old to read anything clearly.
I don't know any Russian, but I do know how to read Cyrillic. Or I can tell him a story that will set me free. Yeah, the 1001 Nights way. It's gotta be about something that will make this Russian born after World War II happy, though. I've got it. This might take a minute. While we wait, bring in that title card.
The story will continue after this.
I bring you title sequence, Russian style.
That was an amazing intro. Wait, how to get to Moscow?
Oil money.
Well, Russia has done crazier things, like whatever was going on in the post-war years to help create the Stilyagi. But what exactly is a Stilyagi? Stilyagi, and its singular Stylyaga, Russian for stylish or style hunters, was a subculture that existed in the Soviet Union from the late 40s to early 60s. It's equitable to the American hipster and beatniks of the same era, sitting in between 2 definitions as both an aesthetical subculture and a perceived youth counterculture. These style hunters would embrace Western fashions, film, music, and any other aspect of which they could get their hands on, circumnavigating state censorship where needed. It should be noted that this term was used derogatorily by the Soviet state and media. There was some dissonance among youths that matched the Stilyagi definition as to if they were truly Stilyagi or not, but that has more to do with state-run media reporting on the kind of person they really were. To the state, they were carefree and uneducated hippies, but to themselves, the Stilyagi were intellectual and artistic visionaries, bringing the outside world to the glorious Union. So how did these young counterculturalists come about? During the last years of the Second World War, as the Red Army pushed west to meet American and British forces in Germany, there was something cultural scholars like myself love to see happen: cultural exchange. You see, these Western allies had access to things not seen often in the Great Union, things like jazz records, Parisian fashions, and other cultural trinkets which were traded between the soldiers. But this is just a footnote in the greater image of the Stilyagi. For what we truly need wouldn't be until around the death of Stalin. The literal death of Stalin. It would be with the first generation of Soviets who came into adulthood in the post-war years that the Stilyagi would crystallize. These young adults of the late 40s and early 50s would be inspired by the spoils of war and cultural exchange brought home by their parents or siblings. They would use these to help form their own cultural identity, Influencing them as well were a group I could not find much information on called the Frontoviki, who were men that stressed fashion and appearance to keep it on vogue with Western trends, as well as bringing in Western media such as films and magazines, something which the later Stilyagi would incorporate in both lifestyle and dress. Alongside the idealized Hollywood image of the West, jazz from musicians like Nat King Cole, the late Glenn Miller, and many others would be heard alongside what remained of the pre-war Soviet jazz scene. Jazz itself would be censored greatly by the state in the late 40s, with many musicians being arrested for even so much as looking at a saxophone. Luckily, there would still be underground movements against the Komsomol's claims of jazz as a tool of Western propaganda or perversion of art. The style of the Stilyagi was more in line with the older Frontoviki, but also possessed more in line of American hipsters, dressing in styles such as zoot suits and more flashy apparel. Such dress only showcased their individualism and rebellion against the USSR in one form or another. In the words of one interviewed Stilyaga, and paraphrased by the great Alexei Yurchak, "They saw themselves as the new Soviet youth, for whom the 1950s was a time loaded with happiness, in which Soviet hopes for the future incorporated creative experiments with literature, poetry, Western music, and foreign clothes, creating a mix of Soviet and Western imaginations." Through the help of shortwave radios and Western films that were deemed acceptable by Soviet censorship standards, these somewhat rebels would learn more and more about the alien cultures of the West. One thing which grew in popularity, and remained constant throughout the next 30 years, was that black market around music present in the Soviet Union. Such objects are considered part of the greater Soviet countercultural movement dubbed samizdat. In the case of the Style Hunters, it ranged from bones, bootleg records made from X-ray copies of actual records, to illegal imports of apparel, magazines, or films brought in by the lucky handful who were able to travel between the borders. Such actions bolstered the attitudes of the Stilyagi, and by extension, the parts of the Soviet populace eager to experience something outside the Iron Curtain. Luckily, the cold European winters would slowly rust this curtain. From the 50s to mid-60s, what is called the Khrushchev thaw occurred, where more consumerist and individualist attitudes slowly crept into the Soviet culture in various facets. The Stilyagi would see somewhat of a boom over the course of the thaw, with more and more youths joining the subculture out of such interest being brought their way. However, thanks to the actions of Brezhnev, the thaw would be thrown back into a Siberian hellscape of control. The Stilyagi would die out slowly over the course of the 60s, dropping from the public zeitgeist in the 70s, but the effect of these style hunters would be felt for the rest of the century. The Stilyagi served as a baseline for Russian artists and countercultural movements that followed. If you can tell from the artwork hanging conveniently behind me to my left... Where'd it go? Wait, why are we back in the dacha?
Military exercises in region.
Well, anyway, the effect the Stilyagi had on the Soviet Union, and later Russia, was a continued interest in Soviet youths towards the Western world. Throughout Alexei Yurchak's Everything Was Forever, Until It Was No More, the good doctor alludes to the power and status that came from foreign objects like American music, British fashion, or West German sportswear. The last, while not mentioned by Yurchak, does provide more context into how Adidas took off in the USSR in the 80s. As for social movements, the Stilyagi were a defining countercultural link in the chain of similar worldwide movements that happened from the 40s to the 60s, much like the American hipsters, beatniks, and more avant-garde types. Of course, now we have to know more about who exactly these Stilyagi were. Referring to themselves as Stilyagi, Shtatniki, or just Chuvaki, these enjoyers of the West were born predominantly in the USSR during the late 20s and 30s, being too young to be conscripted for the Red Army's war effort. Politically neutral, careless of state morality, and in love with any country but their own, the Stilyagi were youths who saw the Soviet Union as a gulag that stretched from Kaliningrad to Magadan. They were people who wanted to embrace something different, something they had never seen before in their lives, and that such thing would be a cause for youthful rebellion against the system in a way fashionable of the 1940s. No, not another war. They rebelled through embracing the outside world, foregoing Stalinist ideals for the zoot suits and swing dancing of the West. So why exactly did they do that? Something seen in a lot of post-war cultures, this normalcy would slowly come into effect over the decade or two following the Second World War. From Japan to England, youths and veterans who would indulge themselves in more hedonistic activities such as partying and exorbitant fashion compared to the rationing and wartime mindset of past years. We would see groups like the American Biker and Greaser, British Teddy Boy, and German Halbstarke rise in this time frame as well, all of them posing one way or another as some youthful escape from a world rebuilding. Speaking of which, the Stilyagi, as a youth subculture, would come to face the same criticism as their Western counterparts. Young people demanded recognition of their own social status outside the official narrative about the correct Soviet man. Thus, the eternal conflict of fathers and sons coincided with the totalitarian state policy, which leveled all ages under the aegis of a single ideology. So, to put it simply, the Stilyagi were just youths wanting to be youths, individualistic and yearning for recognition as such. Beatniki, the Russian term for beatniks, could also be loosely used in this manner. They would dress in these exorbitant fashions and dance to up-tempo music like jazz or swing to show that they were not like their parents or relatives who lived before them, that they were not going to conform to the near entirety with the standards of Soviet society, even to the chagrin of Soviet media at the time, who liked to paint them more as rebellious than they actually were due to this cultural difference. Lastly, there's this idea that floats around whenever you discuss the culture of the Soviet Union, and it's something close to what I love to talk about. Translating from Russian as beyond the border, the term Zagranitsa was the romanticized view many in the Soviet Union had of the Western world. They yearned for any aspect of it they could get their hands on, talking with friends and more shady connections to get their hands on things like blue jeans, postcards, and that illicitly sweet substance known as jazz records. The young speculator begins with a yearning to break out of these surroundings. He is impatient for a better lot, without the hard work which has brought parents and friends small reward. He dismisses the modest improvements of living standards seen since Stalin's death as inadequate. For him, the glamour of Western easy living is irresistible. While this source is from around the same time as the Stilyagi, it only exemplifies the attitude of these hipsters, wanting nothing else to do with Soviet culture in comparison to the general Russian youths at the time, with Yurchek even denoting that the Stilyagi are prescribed as being against more highbrow things like classical music and the future dreamed up by proletariat idealists. But this idea of the West, real or imaginary, was what captivated the Stilyagi, who listened to rock and jazz on their smuggled records or illegal radio waves, and wore their exorbitant Western fashions in chasing that idea of a world they could only dream of. So what exactly was wrong with these dreamers and hipsters? Much like the hippies and anti-war protesters in many nations later in the 60s, the Stilyagi were a movement that went against the ideas of the party at the time. In the eyes of the Soviet Union, these beatniks and jazz freaks were blemishes on the picture-perfect image of communist living, much like what was quoted earlier by Karpova. State authority was against such activities, jazz included, wanting their populace to know of technology and more highbrow cultural artifacts. The picture of this socialist realistic idea of a well-educated member of the proletariat who listened to both the party and reclaimed high cultural items like art and music from the pretentious bourgeoisie. Worse yet is that such degenerate music and fashion was from nations who did not overthrow their upper classes. Sort of an isolationist culture war thing where the party wanted more authoritarian control with anti-cosmopolitan policies, alongside the standard communist revolution. Soviet youths who matched the description of Stilyagi, but loved things considered high culture to a degree, did not entirely see themselves as part of the movement. Yes, there were small groups of people who definitely fit the image of the average Stilyaga, but the ideas behind them were something that resonated with a lot of the younger generation at the time. Many of them yearned to see the outside world, to work with the ideas of the party to bring the USSR to that forefront. They wanted to be swayed by foreign influences, whether the state branded them rebels or not. The Soviet state cast an image of rebellion upon the Stilyagi, who themselves were working within Soviet limitations at the time. Karpova even mentions that the academic and Soviet discourse labeled the Stilyagi more as hooligans than a youth subculture. This hooliganistic caricature was so entrenched by the state that Soviet media, like what you can see here, worked their equivalent of today's baby boomer comics into the concept of the Stilyagi. They painted a broader picture compared to the actual quantity of genuine Stilyagi within the younger generation. For while what characteristics we have discussed in this video were prominent with the subculture, they were also visible to some degree with all young Soviet adults. The Soviet idea of what I can only sum up as well-educated and cultural proletariat workers that the state wanted was at conflict with that of the subculture. This is where it is seen more as a counterculture. The Stilyagi worked towards a more individualist image, and again, many of them would never have considered themselves counterculture, only the voice of their generation when it came to culture. Bit of a wall break here, but I want to try and keep this bit short, as we have been going longer on criticism bits in our last few videos, so I'm just going to leave you with this nice quote from the Journal of Musicology, talking about how the state wasn't happy with this stuff. Other sources will be linked in our source document. The Stilyagi movement was built on the hopes and dreams of people who for once in their lives only wanted to see the outside world, be it through illegal airwaves, imported fashion, or just by watching the big screen whenever propaganda films weren't showing. The only true criticism was that it was both a product of, and target for, the Soviet state. That's the Stilyagi. a group of Soviet youths finding themselves in a post-war Russia, enthralled and guided by neon lights and swinging tunes of a world alien to them. While the state painted them as rebels and ingrates, they were but one small step culturally towards the inevitable thawing of Soviet relations. The end.
What about kiss of goodnight like Matt Putin always do?
I don't think your security agents or Russian masculinity will let me give you a bedtime kiss.
Я понимаю, Comrade Bearcat. That was good bedtime story. You are pardoned from espionage. Here, take signed picture of Edward Snowden as signed to FSB, not to arrest you.
That's actually amazing to hear from someone like you. Wait a minute. There's some kind of catch, isn't there?
Нет, nothing against rights of human involved. Want you to deliver nice, very late Christmas present to good friend Ramzan in Grozny. Just no open it, хорошо?
Well, we are pretty close. And I do like seeing Georgia's mountains. Alright, what could go wrong?